It was a calm afternoon at the small-town police station. The officers were doing their usual work, filing papers, sipping coffee, and chatting quietly about their day. Nothing out of the ordinary ever seemed to happen there. The sound of the clock ticking filled the room, mixing with the faint hum of a fan that spun lazily above their heads. Then out of nowhere, the door burst open. A little girl came running inside. Her face was streaked with tears, her hair tangled, and her small hands were trembling as she tried to catch her breath. Everyone turned at once, startled. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by her shaky voice as she cried out, "Please, help me, please follow me home." The officers froze for a moment. One of them quickly stood up, walking toward her, kneeling down so his eyes met hers. "Hey, it's okay," he said softly. "You're safe here. What's your name?" But the little girl just shook her head, still crying, unable to get the words out. She looked terrified, more than any child should ever have to look. The others gathered around, unsure of what was going on, but sensing it was serious. The way she kept glancing back at the door as if she wanted to run again told them something was terribly wrong. "It's okay," the officer said again, this time putting a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Can you tell me what happened?" The girl's voice was barely a whisper. "My mom, she won't wake up." A cold chill spread through the room. The officer looked at his partner, who immediately reached for his radio, signaling for assistance just in case. The little girl tugged on the officer's hand, crying, "Please, you have to come now. Please hurry." Her voice cracked on every word. Whatever was happening, it was clear she was desperate. Without wasting another second, the officer stood up and said, "All right, let's go." Two more officers followed them as they headed out the door. Outside, the sun was bright, but everything felt heavy. The girl led the way, still crying softly, her small legs moving as fast as they could. The officers walked beside her, keeping their pace slow enough for her to keep up but quick enough to show urgency. People on the street turned to look, some whispering, others just watching quietly as the group passed by. The officer closest to the girl tried to calm her down. "Hey, you're doing great," he said gently. "We're right here with you. We'll help your mom, okay?" She nodded, but her lips quivered. "You have to hurry," she said again, her voice breaking. "She's all alone." They walked down cracked sidewalks and quiet streets. The town wasn't large, but the way they moved made every turn feel longer. The little girl didn't say much else, only glancing up now and then to make sure the officers were still behind her. The farther they went, the more the surroundings changed. The homes became smaller, the paint on the walls faded, and the air felt still, like it hadn't moved in a long time. It wasn't the kind of neighborhood the officers usually patrolled unless someone called for help. Finally, the girl stopped in front of a small, weathered house. The paint on the door had peeled away, and the steps creaked as she walked up them. She turned to look at the officers, her eyes wide and filled with fear. "Please," she said softly, "don't let her die." The officer's heart sank at those words. He knelt again, brushing a tear from her cheek. "We're going to help her," he promised. Then he stood and knocked firmly on the door. No answer. He called out, but the silence inside made his voice sound strange, too loud for such a quiet street. He tried the handle. It turned. The door creaked open slowly and a faint smell drifted out, one that made the officers glance at each other. Something was definitely wrong. The girl stepped inside first, moving quickly through the narrow hallway. "Mom?" she called out, her small voice echoing off the walls. The officers followed, their shoes creaking on the old wooden floor. The inside of the house was dim, with curtains drawn tight. A few rays of light slipped through the cracks, landing on a table covered with unopened mail and empty dishes. The air felt heavy, and there was an uneasy stillness in every corner. "Mom, I brought help," the girl said again, this time louder, as if trying to wake someone. They entered the living room, and there she was, a woman lying on the couch, pale and motionless. The little girl ran to her, shaking her gently. "Mommy, wake up! Please, wake up!" The officer stepped closer, kneeling beside the couch. He checked for a pulse. There was one, faint but there. He immediately radioed for an ambulance, speaking quickly but calmly. "We have an unconscious adult female, pulse weak, possible medical emergency. Need EMS immediately." The little girl clung to her mother's arm, tears falling on her sleeve. She was sick, she said, her voice shaking. She said she was tired, but then she wouldn't wake up. I tried to shake her, but she didn't move. I didn't know what to do. The officer looked around the room. There was barely any food, No sound of running electricity, and the air felt damp. He could tell they had been struggling. His chest tightened as he looked at the child. How brave she must have been to come all the way to the station by herself. He put a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You did the right thing coming to us," he said softly. "You helped your mom. She's going to be okay." The girl nodded weakly, still holding on to her mother's hand. Her small fingers were shaking. The siren of the ambulance grew louder in the distance, and soon paramedics rushed inside. They quickly began to work, checking the woman's vitals, setting up oxygen, moving efficiently but gently. The little girl stood back, watching everything with wide, tearful eyes. She didn't move until one of the officers guided her toward the kitchen to give the medic space. The room there was small, with only a few cans on the counter and an old chair by the wall. The officer offered her some water, and she took it with both hands, sipping slowly. He knelt beside her again. "How long has your mom been sick?" he asked carefully. The girl looked down at the floor. "A few days," she whispered. She said she just needed rest. She didn't want me to worry. But last night she stopped talking. I tried to wake her, but she didn't open her eyes. The officer listened quietly, not interrupting. Every word from the little girl hit him harder than he expected. She was too young to carry something like this. The girl looked up at him again, her eyes red and tired. "I thought if I ran fast enough I could find someone who'd help her," she said. "I didn't know what else to do." The officer swallowed hard, forcing back the lump in his throat. "You're a very brave girl," he said. "You did something amazing today." When the paramedics came out, one of them gave a small nod. "She's stable," they said quietly. "We'll take her to the hospital now." The little girl ran to her mother's side as they lifted her onto the stretcher. She grabbed her hand again, whispering softly, "I told you I'd get help." The mother, barely conscious, gave the slightest squeeze in return. It was small, but it was enough to make tears roll down the girl's cheeks all over again, this time mixed with relief. The officers stood by the doorway, watching as the paramedics carried the stretcher out to the ambulance. The little girl followed them, never letting go of her mother's hand until she had to. One of the officers offered to ride with her, and she nodded silently, climbing into the ambulance seat. As the doors closed, the siren began to wail, fading into the distance as the vehicle sped toward the hospital. Back at the house, the remaining officers stood quietly for a moment. The place was still, the air thick with what they'd just seen. One of them sighed softly and said, "That little girl saved her mom's life today." The others nodded. They knew it was true. In the middle of fear and helplessness, that child had found the courage to run for help, and because of that, there was still hope, and somewhere between the tears, the fear, and the flashing lights, that small act of bravery had already begun to touch everyone who witnessed it. The ride to the hospital felt longer than it really was. The little girl sat quietly in the ambulance seat, holding her mother's cold hand. The paramedics spoke softly to each other, checking the machines and monitoring her mother's heartbeat. Every few seconds, the girl looked up at her mother's face, hoping to see her eyes open, but they stayed shut. The siren outside wailed through the streets, but inside the ambulance, it was quiet. Only the sound of beeping monitors and the girl's soft breathing filled the air. The officer sitting beside her gave a small smile, trying to comfort her. "She's doing okay," he said gently. "You helped her just in time." The girl nodded, but she didn't speak. Her hands were still shaking, and her eyes never left her mother. She was scared that if she looked away, something bad might happen. When they arrived at the hospital, nurses rushed to take the woman inside. The officer lifted the girl into his arms and followed behind. They went through wide hallways filled with busy doctors and the smell of disinfectant. The girl's small face looked pale under the bright white lights. They reached the emergency room where doctors immediately began treating her mother. The officer stood with the girl just outside the curtain watching. The nurses worked quickly, attaching tubes and monitors. Every now and then, a voice would call out a number or instruction. The little girl's fingers gripped the edge of her jacket tightly. After what felt like forever, a nurse finally came out and knelt beside her. "She's stable for now," the nurse said kindly. "She's resting, sweetheart. You did something very brave." The girl's eyes filled with tears again, but this time there was a small flicker of relief in them. "Can I see her?" she asked softly. "Soon," the nurse replied. She needs a little time to rest, but you can stay right here, okay? The officer sat beside her in the waiting area. He got her a cup of water and a blanket. She sat quietly, still hugging her knees to her chest, staring at the closed curtain. Do you have any family we can call? The officer asked gently. The girl shook her head. Just me and Mom. Anyone at all? Maybe a neighbor? No, she said quietly. It's just us. The officer nodded slowly, realizing how alone they really were. The thought made his heart heavy. A little while later, another officer arrived at the hospital. He carried a small bag, the girl's school bag that had been left behind in the house. It looked worn out, the straps frayed, but the way he held it carefully showed that he understood how important it probably was to her. She left this behind, he said softly, handing it over. The girl took it, clutching it tightly against her chest. Hours passed. The doctors eventually allowed her to see her mother for a few minutes. The girl stepped into the room quietly, her small feet making no sound on the floor. Her mother lay still, but looked better than before. There was color on her face now, and her breathing was steady. The girl reached out and gently touched her hand. Mom, she whispered. I told you I'd get help. The woman didn't wake, but her fingers twitched slightly, and the girl smiled through her tears. She stayed like that for a while, holding her hand and resting her head beside it until a nurse kindly asked her to step out again so her mother could rest. Outside, the officer was waiting. He asked the hospital staff to let the girl stay the night since there was no one at home for her. They agreed and arranged a small room nearby with a blanket and pillow. Before she went to sleep, the officer knelt beside her. You were very brave today, he said. Most adults wouldn't have handled it the way you did. You should be proud. The girl gave a tiny nod. I just didn't want her to be alone, she whispered. He smiled gently. And because of you, she isn't. That night, while the world outside went quiet, the little girl finally closed her eyes. For the first time in 2 days, she slept. Not peacefully, but at least with a bit of hope. The next morning, the same officer came back to the hospital to check on them. He brought breakfast, some bread, juice, and fruit. The girl thanked him softly and asked again if she could see her mom. The doctor told her that her mother had regained consciousness for a few minutes earlier that morning, but she was still too weak to talk. When she was finally allowed in, the girl walked carefully to the bedside. Her mother opened her eyes slowly, and a faint smile appeared on her lips. You found help, she said weakly. The girl nodded, tears already forming. I ran to the police station, she said, her voice shaking. I didn't know what to do, so I just ran. Her mother's hand reached for hers, gripping it gently. You saved me, she whispered. The girl didn't reply. She just hugged her arm gently and cried quietly. The doctor and the officer standing nearby looked away for a moment, giving them privacy. It was a quiet scene, heartbreaking yet beautiful in its own way. Later that day, while her mother rested, the officer sat with the girl again in the waiting area. He asked her a few more questions, trying to understand what had led to this. Did your mom have anyone to help her when she got sick? He asked. The girl shook her head. She lost her job a few months ago, she said softly. She said it would be fine. She tried to find work, but then she got sick. She didn't tell anyone. She didn't want people to think she couldn't take care of me. The officer listened carefully, his heart breaking at every word. She always told me not to worry. The girl continued. Even when we didn't have much to eat, she said it was just for a little while. But then she got worse. I tried to make her soup, but she couldn't eat. Her voice trembled. Last night she stopped waking up, so I ran as fast as I could to the station. I didn't know if anyone would listen. The officer swallowed hard, taking a deep breath. You did the right thing, he said firmly. You did everything you could, and because of that, your mom is alive. The girl gave a faint smile, but her eyes looked tired, like she had seen too much for someone her age. As the day went on, the hospital social worker came to talk with them. She explained gently that they would help the family get some support, maybe find a better place to stay for a while. The little girl listened quietly, her hands folded in her lap. She didn't fully understand everything being said, but she understood one thing. People were helping now. The officer promised to visit again the next day, and before he left, he handed her a small stuffed bear from the hospital's donation box. Someone once gave this to my daughter when she was scared, he said. Now I think it belongs to you. The girl smiled softly, hugging the bear close. "Thank you," she whispered. When night came again, the hospital lights dimmed. The little girl sat beside her mother's bed, holding her hand and humming softly, a tune her mother used to sing to her when things were still good. Her mother was too weak to speak, but the soft smile on her face showed she could hear it. Outside, rain began to fall lightly against the window. The world seemed quieter, softer. The officer, who had gone home hours earlier, couldn't stop thinking about the little girl and her mother. Something about that moment, the small child running for help, the way she refused to give up, had stayed with him. He made a call that night to a local charity group, explaining what had happened. He didn't use names, but he asked if there was anything they could do to help a struggling mother and her child. The person on the other end promised to reach out in the morning. Back in the hospital, the little girl finally dozed off in the chair beside her mother. Her hand was still wrapped around her mother's, fingers laced tightly together as if she feared that letting go might make everything fall apart again. The machines hummed softly. The nurse peeked in once to check on them and smiled quietly before leaving. There was something about that small scene, so fragile yet full of strength, that made everyone who saw it feel something deep inside. By the next morning, things began to look a little brighter. The mother was awake, weak but smiling. The doctor said she was improving and could recover fully with proper care and rest. When the little girl heard that, she hugged her mother tightly and whispered, "I told you I'd take care of you." Her mother smiled faintly. "You did, my brave girl," she said, and for the first time in many days, the room filled with something that had been missing for a long time: hope. The morning light streamed softly through the hospital window. The room smelled faintly of medicine and fresh air. The little girl sat beside her mother's bed, peeling the corner of her blanket nervously while her mother rested. She looked better, still weak, but there was color in her face again. Her breathing was steady, her eyes sometimes opening to look at her daughter with a faint, tired smile. The girl didn't want to leave her side, not even for a minute. Every time a nurse came in to check on her mother, she would quietly move aside but keep her eyes on her. She was afraid that if she blinked too long, something might change again. The officer who had helped her the day before returned that morning. He carried a small paper bag in one hand and a gentle smile on his face. "I brought breakfast," he said softly, setting it down on the table. "Thought you both could use something warm." The girl looked up at him and smiled shyly. "Thank you," she whispered. He pulled a chair closer. "How's she doing today?" "She woke up a little," the girl said. "The doctor said she'll get better if she rests." "That's good news," he said. "You must be very relieved." The girl nodded, but there was still worry in her eyes. "We don't have anywhere to go when she gets out," she said softly. "Our house. It's not good anymore." The officer paused for a moment. He had seen their house. It was falling apart, with barely enough inside to live on. He understood what she meant. "We'll figure something out," he said kindly. "You're not alone anymore, okay?" Those words seemed to comfort her more than anything else. She smiled faintly and nodded. Later that day, the doctor visited the room. He spoke gently, explaining that her mother's condition had been caused by extreme exhaustion and lack of nutrition. She needed proper rest, food, and care for a few weeks. The little girl listened carefully, nodding like an adult even though her eyes looked worried. When the doctor left, the officer stayed for a while longer. He talked to the hospital social worker about helping them find a safer place after her mother was discharged. The little girl didn't know all the details, but she could feel that something was changing. People cared now. That evening, the hospital room was quiet. The little girl sat by her mother's bed, holding her hand and telling her small stories about the kind officer, the nurses who smiled at her, and the little stuffed bear she had been given. Her mother listened, eyes half open, a soft smile touching her lips. "You were so brave," she whispered weakly. "I'm proud of you." The girl's eyes filled with tears again, but she tried to hold them back. "I just didn't want to lose you," she said softly. Her mother squeezed her hand gently. "You didn't. You saved me." It was a moment neither of them would forget. Over the next few days, her mother grew stronger. She started eating small meals again and talking more. The hospital staff often stopped by to check on them, not just as patients but as people they had grown to care about. The story of the little girl who ran to the police station had quietly spread around the hospital, and everyone admired her courage. One afternoon, as the girl sat in the hallway drawing on a piece of paper a nurse had given her, a lady approached her with a warm smile. She was part of a local charity group the officer had contacted. She knelt down beside the girl and said, "I heard about what you did. You're very brave. We'd like to help you and your mom for a while, if that's okay." The girl blinked, unsure what to say. "Help us?" "Yes," the lady said kindly. "We can help you find a safe place to stay and make sure your mom gets the care she needs." The girl's eyes widened. "Really?" "Really," the lady said. "You've been through a lot. You both deserve a fresh start." When the officer returned later that day, the girl ran to him with excitement. "They're going to help us," she said, almost jumping as she spoke. He smiled warmly. "I told you good things happen when you ask for help." Her mother, still weak but smiling, nodded from her bed. "You've done more than enough," she said softly to him. "I don't know how to thank you." He shook his head. "You don't have to. Your daughter reminded us what real courage looks like." The day her mother was discharged from the hospital, the officer came again, this time to drive them to their new temporary home. It wasn't big, but it was clean and cozy, with sunlight streaming through the windows and the smell of fresh paint. The little girl ran around the small space, smiling for the first time in weeks. "This is ours?" she asked, eyes wide. "For now, yes," the lady from the charity group said, "until your mom gets better and you both find something more permanent." Her mother sat down on the edge of the small bed, her eyes welling up. "It's perfect," she said quietly. "Thank you so much." The girl hugged her mother tightly, then turned to the officer. "You'll come visit, right?" He chuckled softly. "You bet I will." Over the next few weeks, their lives slowly began to change. Her mother regained her strength, and the charity group helped her get medical checkups and counseling. They also arranged for some groceries and clothing. The officer visited often, bringing small things like books and puzzles for the girl. Every time he came, she would run to greet him with a smile that could melt anyone's heart. One day, he brought her a small notebook. "You can write about your days in here," he said. "Maybe even about what happened. Sometimes writing helps when words feel heavy." The girl opened it carefully, tracing her fingers over the blank pages. "I don't know how to start," she admitted. "How about this?" he said, smiling. "Start with, 'One day I ran for help.'" She laughed softly. "Okay," she said. "That's a good start." In the evenings, after her mom went to bed, she would sit by the window with her notebook and write in her small, careful handwriting. She wrote about the police station, about the flashing ambulance lights, about the people who helped her, and every time she wrote, she felt lighter, as if the words carried away a little piece of fear each time. Her mother often watched her from the bed with a quiet smile. "You've grown up so much," she said one night. "You're stronger than I ever was." The girl looked up. "You're strong too," she said. "You just got tired." Tears filled her mother's eyes at those words. She pulled her daughter close and whispered, "You're my reason for everything." Days turned into weeks, and soon her mother was healthy enough to walk outside again. They would go to the nearby park sometimes just to feel the sun and hear the laughter of other children. The officer joined them a few times, bringing ice cream or snacks. He never stayed too long, but his visits always made them both smile. One afternoon, as they sat on a bench watching the sunset, the girl said, "When I grow up, I want to help people too." "Like you did?" The officer smiled warmly. "Then you'll make the world a better place," he said. She grinned. "I'll tell people to never give up, no matter how hard things get." "That's the best advice anyone could give," he said. That night, when they returned home, her mother looked at her with pride. "You've changed so much," she said softly. "You're not just my little girl anymore, you're my hero." The girl shook her head, smiling. "No, you're mine." They both laughed quietly, the kind of laugh that only comes after surviving something difficult. It wasn't a perfect life. They still had challenges ahead, but it was better. They had hope, they had people who cared, and they had each other. The darkness that had once filled their days was slowly being replaced with light. The officer checked in on them often, but over time, he saw that they were doing fine. The girl had started school again, her mother had begun working part-time, and they were settling into their new life. Every time he visited, there was something new. A plant on the windowsill, drawings on the fridge, laughter in the air. The last time he visited, the little girl handed him a folded piece of paper. "It's for you," she said shyly. He opened it and saw a drawing. It was of the police station, with a little girl running toward it. and an officer kneeling to help her. At the bottom she had written in her uneven handwriting, "Thank you for listening to me." He smiled and felt his eyes sting. "This is the best thing anyone's ever given me," he said softly. The girl grinned, her eyes bright. "It's our story," she said proudly. He nodded. "It sure is," and in that small, quiet moment, surrounded by warmth, laughter, and the promise of better days, everyone realized something. Sometimes the smallest act of courage can change everything. The days began to blend together in a quiet, peaceful rhythm. The little girl had returned to school, and her mother had started doing small tasks for a local store, helping organize shelves and handle customers. It wasn't much, but it was something, and for them it felt like a brand new beginning. Their small home, once silent and empty, now felt alive. The scent of warm food filled the air. Laughter echoed in the evenings, and the little girl's drawings were taped proudly on the walls. Every corner of that house carried a trace of hope, a hope that had been almost lost not long ago. The officer still stopped by from time to time, not because he had to, but because he wanted to see how they were doing. Each visit reminded him why he became a police officer in the first place. He wasn't just there to enforce rules. He was there to protect people, to listen, to care. One Saturday morning, he arrived with a small box in his hand. When the little girl opened the door and saw him, her face lit up with joy. "You came," she said, smiling wide. "Of course," he said. "I promised I'd visit." She moved aside quickly. "Come in. Mom's cooking breakfast." Inside, the house smelled like pancakes. Her mother greeted him warmly, her smile brighter than before. She looked stronger now, healthier, and her eyes carried the calmness of someone who finally felt safe. "I just wanted to drop something off," the officer said, handing the box to the girl. "It's nothing big." She opened it and gasped. Inside were school supplies, colorful notebooks, pencils, and a new backpack. "You remembered," she said, hugging it tightly. "I told you education is your superpower," he said with a grin. The mother watched quietly, her eyes shining. "You've done so much for us already," she said softly. "I don't even know how to repay you." He smiled kindly. "You already have. Seeing you both doing well, that's enough." The little girl ran to the table and started organizing her new supplies, arranging them neatly in rows. Her excitement filled the room, and the officer couldn't help but smile. After breakfast, they sat outside for a bit. The morning sun was gentle and the street was quiet. The mother talked about her new part-time job and how she hoped to find something permanent soon. The officer listened, nodding thoughtfully. "I used to feel like the world forgot about us," she said. "I was so scared every day, but then my little girl ran for help and everything changed." The officer looked at her and said, "Sometimes it takes one brave act to remind everyone that kindness still matters." She smiled at that, a quiet smile that came from deep inside her heart. That afternoon, the little girl asked her mother if they could go visit the police station. She wanted to thank everyone who had helped her that day. Her mother agreed, and the officer offered to drive them. When they walked in, the station felt different this time. The last time she had been there, she was crying and terrified. Now she walked in smiling, holding her mother's hand. The same officers who had seen her that day looked up and smiled warmly. "Well, look who's here," one of them said cheerfully. "The bravest little girl in town." She laughed shyly. "I just wanted to say thank you for helping my mom." One of the officers knelt down to her level. "You're the reason we found her in time," he said. "We should be thanking you." The little girl's eyes sparkled. "Mom says we got a second chance." The room went quiet for a moment. Everyone knew what that meant. They spent a while there, talking and laughing. Before they left, the chief came out and handed the girl a small badge-shaped pin. "This is for courage," he said with a smile. "You earned it." The girl looked at it with awe, her eyes wide. "For me?" "For you," he said proudly. She pinned it on her shirt immediately and grinned from ear to ear. That moment stayed with everyone who saw it. Even hardened officers who had seen difficult days and tough cases couldn't help but feel their hearts soften. That tiny act of bravery from a small child had reminded them why they did what they did. In the following weeks, the story quietly spread around the town. It wasn't printed in newspapers or shown on TV. It was passed along through whispers, through neighbors, through people who had once turned away, but now stopped to ask, "How are you doing?" The little girl and her mother began to receive kind gestures from people they didn't even know. Bags of groceries were sometimes left at their door. The local school donated some clothes. The woman at the corner bakery always saved an extra loaf of bread for them. At first, her mother felt shy about accepting help. She didn't want pity, but over time she realized it wasn't pity, it was love. It was people showing that they cared. One evening, as the little girl sat doing her homework, her mother sat beside her and said softly, "You see, the world isn't as cold as it once felt." The girl looked up, smiling. "That's because you're getting better," she said innocently. Her mother laughed gently. "Maybe, but I think it's because of you." The girl leaned her head on her mother's shoulder. "Do you think people can forget bad days forever?" she asked. Her mother thought for a moment. "Maybe not forget," she said, "but they can heal. And when you heal, the bad days don't feel as heavy anymore." Outside, the wind rustled through the trees. The quiet of the evening was peaceful, filled with the sounds of a neighborhood slowly coming back to life. The officer still visited every Sunday. Sometimes he brought snacks, sometimes a book, sometimes just himself. It became a kind of routine, a symbol of how something terrible had turned into something good. One day when he arrived, he found the girl sitting on the porch with her notebook open. "Writing again?" he asked. She nodded, smiling. "I'm writing about my mom. I want to tell our story someday." "That's a beautiful idea," he said. "What's the title?" She paused for a moment, tapping her pen. "Maybe, The Day I Ran for Help." He smiled softly. "That's perfect." She looked up at him curiously. "Do you think people will care about our story?" The officer thought for a moment before answering. "If people hear it, they'll remember it. Because it's real. And because it shows what courage looks like." The girl nodded thoughtfully. "I just want people to know that it's okay to ask for help," she said. "It doesn't make you weak." He smiled proudly. "That's the best message you could ever share." Months passed and their lives slowly found balance. The mother started working full-time at a small local shop. The girl excelled in school, her teachers often praising her for her kindness and hard work. Every time she got a good grade, she would proudly show the badge pin on her backpack. "It's my lucky badge," she'd say with a smile. One winter afternoon, it started to snow lightly. The little girl ran outside laughing as snowflakes landed on her hands. Her mother stood at the door, watching her with tears in her eyes, not of sadness, but of pure gratitude. The officer happened to stop by that same evening. When he saw them, he smiled. "Looks like things are going well," he said. The mother nodded, wiping a tear from her cheek. "Better than I ever imagined." He looked at the girl who was now busy making a small snowman in the yard. "She's come a long way," he said. "She saved both of us," her mother replied softly. "Not just my life, but my hope." For a moment, no one spoke. The snow fell gently around them, covering the world in a soft white blanket. That night, as the lights dimmed and the girl fell asleep holding her notebook, her mother tucked her in and whispered, "Thank you for not giving up on me." The little girl stirred slightly in her sleep, her hand still clutching the stuffed bear the officer had given her months ago. The mother stood by the window, looking out at the quiet street, her heart full. She had no riches, no grand house, no luxury, but she had something far greater. She had her daughter. She had a community that cared. She had hope again, and in that simple truth she found peace. A year had passed since that day when the little girl had run to the police crying for help. So much had changed since then that sometimes it felt like it had all been a dream. But every time her mother looked at her daughter's smile, she was reminded that it was real. Painfully, beautifully real. Their life wasn't perfect, but it was peaceful. The little girl now woke up each morning to the smell of breakfast instead of fear. She went to school with her head held high, her favorite backpack on her shoulders, and that small badge-shaped pin still attached to the strap, the same one the police chief had given her for courage. Every time she touched it, she remembered how far they had come. Her mother was now working full-time at the small store down the street. She had built a reputation for being reliable, polite, and hard-working. Customers liked her, and sometimes they even asked about her daughter. "She's the brave one," they would say with admiration. At night, after dinner, the two of them often sat by the window together. The mother would read and the girl would write in her notebook, the same one where she had started to tell their story. It had become her way of remembering, but also her way of healing. One evening, the officer stopped by again, as he often did. He brought with him a box of cookies from the bakery, something he did every time he came over. The little girl ran to greet him. "You came," she said happily. "I told you," he said with a smile. "You can't get rid of me that easily." Her mother came from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a towel. "You always bring too much," she said, shaking her head, though she was smiling. "It's not too much," he replied. "It's just my way of checking in." They all sat together, talking about little things, school, work, and how fast time seemed to pass. The girl told him proudly that she had been chosen to read a story at her school's assembly next week. "That's wonderful," he said. "What story are you reading?" She smiled shyly. "It's one I wrote myself." "Really?" he asked, leaning forward with interest. "What's it about?" She hesitated for a second, then said softly, "It's about a little girl who ran for help when things got scary, and how people helped her and her mom." The room grew quiet for a moment. Her mother looked at her, emotion filling her eyes. "That sounds like a very special story," the officer said finally. "I think a lot of people will learn something from it." The girl nodded. "I want people to know that asking for help isn't wrong. I used to think no one would listen, but they did." The officer smiled warmly. "You're going to make a big difference, you know that?" She laughed a little. "Maybe just a small one." The next week came quickly. On the day of the school assembly, the gym was filled with students, teachers, and a few parents. The little girl stood on stage holding her paper nervously. Her mother sat in the audience, her hands trembling slightly. When it was her turn to speak, the girl took a deep breath and began. Her voice was small at first, but it grew stronger with each word. She told the story simply, and not with drama, but with truth. She didn't name anyone or mention where it happened. She just spoke from her heart. She talked about being scared, about running to find help, about how people listened, how they cared, and how that moment changed her life. When she finished, the room was silent for a few seconds. Then slowly the audience began to clap. Not loud or rushed, but steady and heartfelt. Her mother wiped her eyes quietly as pride filled her chest. Afterward, the principal came up to the girl and said, "That was one of the most honest stories we've ever heard here. You have a gift." The girl blushed. "Thank you." The officer, who had come to watch quietly from the back, smiled to himself. He hadn't told them he was coming. He wanted it to be her moment. When she saw him afterward, she ran to hug him. "You came," she said again, beaming. "Of course I did," he said. "I wouldn't miss it for the world." From that day on, something shifted in their little town. The girl's story started to spread, not through media or headlines, but through word of mouth. Teachers talked about it in class. Parents told it to their kids at bedtime. People began to look at their neighbors differently, with a little more kindness, a little more care. One afternoon, a woman approached the girl's mother at the store. She looked nervous at first. "I heard your daughter's story," she said quietly. "It gave me courage to ask for help too." "Thank you," her mother smiled softly. "You don't owe us thanks. Just promise you'll keep going. That's what matters." That night, when she told her daughter about it, the little girl smiled. "So maybe I did make a small difference," she said, her eyes bright. Her mother hugged her tightly. "You made a big one, sweetheart. Bigger than you know." Seasons changed again. The cold of winter turned into the gentle warmth of spring. Flowers began to bloom outside their little home, and laughter filled the air once more. One afternoon, the officer invited them both to a small community event. The police department was hosting an open day for families, with games, music, and a chance for children to see what officers do. At first, the girl was shy. She remembered how scared she had been the first time she stepped inside that building. But when she walked in this time, everything felt different. She saw other children laughing, trying on police hats, sitting in the patrol cars. The same officers who had once searched for her mother were now smiling and waving at her. The chief came over and greeted them warmly. "Our little hero," he said fondly. "Good to see you again," the girl laughed. "I'm not little anymore." The chief chuckled. "No, you're not. But you'll always be the brave one." Later that afternoon, they gathered everyone for a short speech. The chief talked about community, kindness, and how small actions can save lives. Then, to everyone's surprise, he called the little girl up front. "She doesn't know this," he said, smiling, "but her courage that day inspired many of us. Sometimes, we need reminders that bravery doesn't always wear a uniform. Sometimes it comes in the form of a child who refuses to give up. The crowd applauded as the girl stood there wide-eyed and shy, her cheeks red. The chief handed her a small framed certificate for courage, compassion, and reminding us what it means to care. Her mother clapped from the crowd, tears running down her cheeks. The officer stood nearby, his heart full. That evening after the event, they sat by the lake near the edge of town. The sun was setting, painting the sky in soft orange and pink colors. The little girl leaned against her mother, the framed certificate resting on her lap. "Do you think everything happens for a reason?" she asked softly. Her mother looked out at the water for a moment before answering, "I think some things do. Maybe the hard parts happen so we can find the good again." The girl nodded slowly. "I think so too." They sat there quietly, watching the reflection of the sunset ripple across the lake. For the first time in a long while, the world didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt peaceful. It felt full of possibilities. As they got up to leave, the girl looked back one last time at the fading sun. "I think I'm ready to write a new story now," she said. Her mother smiled gently. "Then let's start it together." They walked home hand in hand, the path ahead of them glowing softly under the evening light. The sound of laughter echoed faintly in the distance. Children playing, families talking, life moving forward. Their story, born out of fear and pain, had become one of strength and love. It had changed not only their lives but also the hearts of many around them. And though the world outside would continue to face its own troubles, somewhere in that small town, a little girl had already reminded everyone that courage isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a quiet voice that says, "Please help me," and the kindness that answers back.